Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here tonight. And before I start, since this really is a patriotic topic, I want to take kind of a point of personal privilege and recognize three of the greatest Americans it's ever been my privilege to know. The first one is Chris Hammonds, who just talked here. You don't know this about Chris, but he had the vision to conceive of the Center for Law and Liberty and the leadership and the ability to make it a reality. Also tonight, right in front of me is General Don Wagner, retired Air Force General, who I've been very honored, and Chris has been as well, to have him come and audit some of our classes. I cannot get enough of him because he generally agrees with me on my points on my classes. Then thirdly, a very, very, very important person. This is a person that I've known for more than 50 years. He's the man who persistently encouraged me to come to teach here at HBU, and that turns out to have been perhaps the second greatest decision of my life. And that, of course, is Dr. Stuart Morris, who's right here in front of us. And please give him a big round of applause. In case you don't know about Dr. Morris, of course, he was a World War II veteran, but he was also the founder of our university, and he is also the primary benefactor of the Center for Law and Liberty. And without him, we would never have been able to begin our new building of Independence Hall that's going to start taking place very, very soon. So thank you very much, Dr. Hammonds, General Wagner, and Dr. Morris for all the things that you've done. I want to begin tonight with a question, which is, who the heck is George Mason? Which is the response I got from most of my students when I told them that we would be talking about him. So I want to show you his picture. Right there. That's George Mason. Now, George Mason is one of our forgotten founders. Most importantly, this is the man who more than anyone else is responsible for our Bill of Rights. I'm going to try to tell you the story of his life in 12 snapshots. And as my students know, I cannot lecture without a chart and an outline. So you have both in your hand tonight. So the 12 Roman numerals are going to be the 12 snapshots that I'm going to talk about. So our first snapshot is, who is George Mason? Let me answer that question this way. We have three magnificent documents in our history that weave the tapestry of our country together. The first one is the Declaration of Independence. The second one is the U.S. Constitution. And the third one is the Bill of Rights. George Mason played the most decisive role of any founder in the formation of all three of those documents. Mason was the founder who was most respected by the other founders. Thomas Jefferson praised him as the wisest man of the generation. Pulitzer Prize winner Joseph J. Ellis writes, and this is a quote, "Even though Mason is virtually invisible in our time, George Mason was the most respected founder in his own time. He was a man of unshakable commitment to natural rights, to individual liberty, and most importantly, to a written Bill of Rights. These commitments were sorely tested during the period of the ratification debates. And we're also going to see that he never betrayed our trust in his dedication to these principles. He was also a very important aspect of his personality, a very dedicated Christian, and more than any other founder, he insisted on morality in public life. There were two distinct creative moments in the founding of our country. The first was the War of Independence from England, and the second was the invention of the United States. George Mason was a central figure in both. No other founder has his credentials, and his true genius was that he guided us into forming a government that had enough power to govern us, but also was so carefully constructed in its architecture that it allowed us to establish and preserve in perpetuity individual liberty and individual rights. Mason was the author of four very important documents that formed our founding. The first one is the Virginia Declaration of Rights of 1776. You may have never heard of this before, but it very much provided the blueprint 5 weeks later for Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Also in 1776, George Mason wrote the Virginia Constitution, which later served as a model for the United States Constitution. The third document, and the one that we'll spend most time on tonight, that he wrote were his objections to the new U.S. Constitution. And he wrote that in 1787. This document is the document that more than anything else resulted in the population of our country demanding that we have a written Bill of Rights as part of our ratification of the Constitution. And the fourth document was a list of 20 proposed amendments to the Constitution that were adopted by the Virginia Ratifying Convention in 1788. And the rights there, if you look at the back side of the handout, I have charted out the 29 major rights in the first 8 amendments of the Constitution, and you can see how most of these were contained in the 20 amendments proposed by Mason at the Virginia Ratifying Convention. Now, if all this is true, if he really was this important, if he really was involved in these 3 important documents that form the fabric of our country, if he really wrote these 4 other documents that provided the models for these documents, why is it that he's a forgotten founder? Why don't we celebrate his birthday? Why don't we teach his life in our schools? Well, I think that there are really 4 answers to this question. First, although Mason played a decisive role in the Declaration of Independence, in the Bill of Rights, and in the Constitution, he actually never signed any of them. Second, unlike many of our other founders, Mason valued his private life much more than he valued position, status, and public office. Third, unlike some of our other founders, Mason had very little or maybe even no interest in fame, either in his own lifetime or in future generations. Of all the founders, he's the only one that did not leave memoirs or a diary or an autobiography or a carefully composed inscription for his tomb. And then fourthly, more than anything else, Mason enjoyed being on his farm at Gunston Hall in Virginia. It's been a very interesting journey for me to discover the life of this man, and I hope that you will enjoy going through the story, these snapshots of his life this evening with me. I, of course, am going to give you the highlights of what he did and how he became a great man, or what he did to become a great man. But I also, as I went through this, particularly for our students here today, wanted to see if I could come up with an explanation as to why he was able to achieve greatness. What made George Mason special? What was it about him that allowed him to withstand the incredible public pressure that was exerted upon him by the other founders? And so I think that at the end, I'm going to have some suggestions that I'd like to share with you after you hear the story of his life. Now, this takes us to snapshot number 2, which is George Mason prepares for greatness, and he's going to do this in the library of his uncle. Mason was born on December 11th, 1725, and he was only 9 years old when his father died. His father owned the plantation next door to George Washington's plantation, and his father was in a sailboat that capsized in the Potomac and left George without a father. George formed a friendship with George Washington, who also lost his father at an early age. Washington lost his father at only 11 years of age. And naturally, George Mason turned to older men in his life to be a mentor and guide for them. The most important figure in his life was his uncle, who is an attorney in Virginia named John Mercer. And Mercer undertook the responsibility for George Mason's education. And I, for one, am incredibly grateful that he did so. Mercer tutored him personally in Greek and in Latin and in French. When George became 12, he sent George to a very good, fine private school in Maryland. The family minister also assisted George in ordering books from London that might not have been in Mercer's library. And importantly, Mercer became well known even as a child for taking every single hour that he could to study the works of the great authors. Now, Mercer had the best library in Virginia, and he owned more than 1,800 volumes. And so George spent many, many years in there. The next slide is going to be a picture of Plato, Aristotle, and Polybius, I hope. Yes. So, Mercer's library included many works of political philosophy by these men. And these men are the thinkers that first established the natural law tradition, the concept of a mixed constitution, and the necessity of the separation of powers for mixed constitution. Slide 4 are the portraits of Sir Edward Coke and John Locke. Sir Edward Coke, of course, we study him intensively in my classes, was the English judge who established the sovereignty of law, our most important principle of government, over the English king and the English parliament. John Locke had perhaps the most significant influence in George Mason. Mercer's library included Locke's three most important and influential works. The first, an essay on human understanding, shook the world because it provided for the first time a certain way to know with certainty the precepts of natural law. The second work, Locke's famous Second Treatise of Civil Government, showed how you could have an architecture of a government that could establish and maintain justice and individual liberty. And then the third one, Locke's Letter Concerning Toleration, is Locke's great argument for religious liberty. And it's the great contribution of our Bill of Rights, in the words that George Mason penned, that we became the first nation in the history of the world who gave true and meaningful religious liberty to everyone, regardless of their faith. These works in Mercer's library provided Mason with a deep understanding of how God creates each one of us as a free, independent, and equal individual, and how God establishes and endows us with inalienable natural rights, and also that we have the duty not only to enforce these rights for ourselves, but to pass them on to our posterity. And I'm glad to say, announce tonight, that our Paracletus Press here at HBU is developing a reader with the excerpts from these same works that we'll be using in our legal studies curriculum here at HBU. This takes us to our snapshot number 3, which is Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights. This picture is a depiction of the 5th Constitutional Congress in Virginia on the day, May 20th, 1776, when they adopted Mason's Declaration of Rights. The next three slides are going to show the influence of Mason's Declaration, how Locke influenced Mason's Declaration, and how Mason's Declaration then influenced Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Now I want you to pay attention to what I have in red letters on each of these slides, that all these documents share 3 foundation principles. The first one is that God creates each of us as an equal and independent human being. Second, God endows each of us with inalienable natural rights. And third, that these rights include the rights to life, liberty, property, safety, and the pursuit of happiness. Slide 6 is an excerpt from John Locke's Second Treatise of Civil Government, section 6, in which he states a famous quote that all my students, of course, have to memorize in each of my classes. I see many of you nodding. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that, being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Now look how closely then Mason is going to track this language in the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776. That all men are born equally free and independent and have certain inherent natural rights, of which they cannot by any compact derive or divest their posterity, among which are the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Slide 8 then is an excerpt of famous language from Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Jefferson relied heavily on Mason in drafting the Declaration, and he says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," which takes us to snapshot number 4 from Mason's life, and that's what Mason did at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Slide 9 is a picture of the Assembly Room inside Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Thanks very much to Dr. Morris's generosity. In a few years, I'm going to actually be able to teach my constitutional law courses in this room, and I look forward to that with great gratitude to you, Dr. Morris. Mason served as a delegate at the Philadelphia Convention from May 14th to September 17th, 1787. The U.S. Constitution borrows many of its provisions from Mason's Virginia Constitution that he wrote 11 years earlier. Mason was among the most vocal and respected of all the delegates. He spoke 136 times on the convention floor, and he vigorously advocated a mixed constitution with separation of powers maintained by checks and balances. He based his arguments on Aristotle's Politics, Polybius's Histories, Machiavelli's Discourses on Livy, and perhaps most importantly, Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws. Again, each of these works is a fundamental work that we study in the curriculum in legal studies here at Houston Baptist University. One thing that was much more meaningful to us perhaps a week ago is that the founders could not agree on what the standard for impeachment would be, including impeachment of the president. It was Mason who came up with the words high crimes and misdemeanors that eventually went in there. If you want to know what high crimes and misdemeanors mean, pray. Seriously, the best explanation I've ever seen that's available on YouTube is the argument that Alan Dershowitz, an emeritus professor from Harvard Law School, gave. I think he's exactly right on. But since it's not defined, it has been the source of many arguments. Mason had high hopes for the new Constitution at the beginning of the convention, but as the convention progressed, he began to become increasingly concerned that too much power was being given to the centralized federal government. Mason cited Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws more than any other work, and he also cited English history to argue extensively for meaningful limits on federal power. Mason argued unsuccessfully for term limits for the president. He argued unsuccessfully that it should be the Senate and not the president who appointed Supreme Court justices, who appointed ambassadors, and who negotiated and made treaties. He also argued, and he was exactly right on this, as on most of his points, that the federal judiciary was given way too much power. Although Mason failed in these arguments, he did succeed on a number of other important arguments to get power taken away from the president, which he feared would very easily become a king, and had that power transferred to the Congress. One of these important powers, for example, was the power to declare war. In England, that was traditionally the sole prerogative of the monarch, but thanks to Mason's efforts, it requires a motion by Congress. And by the way, the last time we declared war in this country was in 1942 against Romania. Mason's core doctrine of government, based on Greek, Roman, and English history, was a distrust of centralized government. England had learned under the reign of James II from 1685 to 1688 that they had no hope of having their liberties respected without a written Declaration of Rights. Even today, England does not have a constitution here in 2020. The reason for that is that the rulers in England do not want a constitution that limits their powers. Mason argued 500 years of history at the Constitutional Convention when he argued for a written Bill of Rights. And he argued that throughout English history, it had only been by written documents that the English ever had any hope of having rights respected. The first one was in 1215 with Magna Carta. The second one was in 1628 with the Petition of Right. The third was in 1679 with the Habeas Corpus Act. And then the last was the English Declaration of Rights, which we call the English Bill of Rights, in 1689. This takes us then to the fifth snapshot, which was Mason's demand for a Bill of Rights at the Constitutional Convention. For all the reasons I've given you, Mason led the fight for a written Bill of Rights. There were two motions that were made at the Constitutional Convention for a written Bill of Rights. The first was on August 20th, 1787, when Charles Pinckney of South Carolina proposed that the Constitution include guarantees of liberty, including liberty of press and freedom from quartering in one's homes. His motion was transferred to the motion for detail, and they took absolutely no action on it. Slide 10 is the portraits of Elbridge Gerry and George Mason. On September 12, 1787, the second motion for a Bill of Rights was made by Elbridge Gerry and seconded by Mason. Gerry was from Massachusetts, and he made a motion that a new committee be set up that would consider a new Bill of Rights for the American Constitution based on state declarations of rights that had recently been adopted across the country. What this really was, though, was code for the Virginia Declaration of Rights written by George Mason, because all the other states had copied Mason. The convention debated Gerry's and Mason's motion, And during the debate, Mason based his arguments for a written Bill of Rights on English history. He particularly emphasized the 3 years of tyranny under James II that ended in the Glorious Revolution. And during the debate, he turned to the delegates and said, "Is it not true that there was not a single person in our country who would have trusted his individual liberties to the political interpretation of the English government in 1776? And then he said there is no reason that any individual of the country should entrust their liberties to an American government in 1787 or 1887 or any time in the future. Therefore, Mason said that we must have a written Bill of Rights. But despite these arguments, Mason lost the debate for a Bill of Rights in the new Constitution. And as the delegates grew weary after 4 months and some began to leave early, he became convinced that he would never get a Bill of Rights at the convention. Which takes us to snapshot number 6. Mason's objections to the federal Constitution. Slide 11 is the manuscript that Mason wrote out in his own hand of his 17 objections to the American Constitution. He gives 4 primary reasons, and these reasons are very insightful. First of all, he said that the Constitution did not have a Bill of Rights. The first 6 words of his objections are, "There is no Declaration of Rights." Second, the Constitution, he said, did not sufficiently limit the powers of the executive branch. There were no term limits on the president. The president could be elected over and over and over again. And because of his power of making appointments, Mason feared that he would be able to secure a tyrannical position on power. Third, the Constitution did not adequately limit the powers of the judiciary. Mason foresaw, as Judge Robert Gates of New York did, who wrote under the name of Brutus, that the federal judiciary would take the powers granted to it under their lifetime appointments and expand the powers of the federal government to such a point that they would eradicate the ability of states to meaningfully pass laws and enforce them for themselves. And fourth, and perhaps most insightful to Mason's character, he objected strenuously that the Constitution did not stop the slave trade. Mason saw an importation on slaves, a ban on importation of slaves, as the first important step towards abolishing slavery altogether. Mason repeatedly warned the Constitutional Convention about slavery. This is a quote from one of his speeches. "Slavery brings a judgment of heaven on the country. As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be rewarded or punished in this one. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, Providence punishes national sins by national calamities." There were only 2 states where importation of slaves was still legal at this time. These were South Carolina and Georgia. Mason argued that they should be excluded from the new Union if they did not ban the importation of slaves. Madison, on the other hand, argued that leaving these 2 states out would be a worse evil than slavery. Unfortunately, as on so many important issues, Mason would lose this debate as well. South Carolina and Georgia reached an agreement with the northern states that sealed Mason's loss on this issue. Under this deal, Georgia and South Carolina received an assurance that the importation of slaves would remain legal in our country for 20 more years. This is the migration or importation clause of Article 1, Section 8. What did the northern states get? The northern states very much wanted the power to regulate commerce and navigable waters by a majority vote in Congress, rather than the 2/3 vote, which they were afraid would be passed. So in exchange for 20 more years of importation of slaves, the northern states received the Commerce Clause of Article 1, Section 8 that allowed Congress to regulate commerce merely by majority vote. This, by the way, has been the single clause that the Supreme Court has used to overly expand federal power the last 229 years. Thirdly, under this deal, and financially this was very important, the New England slave ship owners continued their de facto monopoly on the slave trade, shipping slaves from Africa to South Carolina and Georgia. Records show that just in the years from 1801 to 1808, they imported 156,000 new slaves. Mason also foresaw, correctly as it turned out, that the power of the federal government would eventually destroy the power of the states to pass and enforce their own laws. The proposed Constitution simply made the federal government too powerful. Mason saw that the two levels of government would never be able to coexist under the Constitution as then written. Eventually, one would destroy the other, and Mason foresaw that the overwhelming power of the federal government would complete its conquest of the states. Which brings us to snapshot number 7. For all of these reasons, Mason refused to sign the Constitution at the end of the Constitutional Convention. The Constitution was signed by delegates on September 17, 1787. Only 2 other delegates joined Mason in refusing to sign. One was Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. Gerrymandering always gets me wrong on that name. And the second was Governor Edmund Randolph of Virginia. Both of these men joined with Mason, and their primary reason for not signing the Constitution was because it had no Bill of Rights. Great pressure, incredible pressure, was put on Mason by people who had been his lifelong friends. They even changed the wording at the end of the Constitution to try to persuade Mason to sign it. But Mason's final response, which Madison was very careful to resign, was this: "I would sooner chop off my right hand than put it to this Constitution as it now stands." Which takes us to snapshot number 8, the Don Quixote of the Constitution. Slide 13 is a picture of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, and I'm sure that y'all know the story, but we often forget what motivated Don Quixote to go off on his knight-errant adventures. And that was this. Remember at the beginning of the book, it is reading idealistic books, many books, that inspire him to reject the world in which he lived and try to have an ideal life that was better. And you'll see how that's going to play into something I'm going to tell you about. Mason was a neighbor and lifelong friend for more than 30 years of George Washington. Mason was probably the second most respected man in America next to Washington himself. 2 events, however, were omens that their friendship was doomed. When Mason was returning from the Constitutional Convention to Fairfax County in Virginia, there was an accident in his carriage. His carriage flipped over and he was seriously injured. George Washington, on the same trip home, his carriage crossed a bridge and the bridge collapsed under him. Washington thought Mason was disloyal because Mason had not signed the Constitution, and this was a value that George Washington probably valued above everything else. And as a consequence, Mason lost Washington's friendship, and although he tried in later years, he was never able to regain it. To make matters worse, during the Philadelphia Convention, George Washington had bought a copy of Don Quixote, which he read in his off hours. And privately, he began to call George Mason the Don Quixote of the Constitution. Like Don Quixote, Mason had studied these great idealistic works, and he was trying to follow them in his campaign for a Bill of Rights. Mason also received a very unpopular reception in Virginia when he returned home. The city of Alexandria was very close to his home in Fairfax County, and as he approached the city of Alexandria, he was greeted by the mayor and the entire city council. And they came out to tell George Mason, who had previously been one of the most popular men in Virginia, that he should not enter their city. They did not want him there. The people did not want him there. And furthermore, that because he had refused to sign the Constitution, they did not feel that they could guarantee his safety. Mason didn't hesitate. He immediately told the mayor to turn around and go into the city and announce that he was coming, and that as soon as he got to the center of town, he was going to give a speech explaining why he did what he did. And that's exactly what he did. It's recorded by one of the newspaper reporters there that a heckler from the crowd shouted to George Mason, "Mr. Mason, you must have lost your mind in deciding not to sign the Constitution." And Mason, without missing a beat, turned to him and said, "Sir, if you were to lose your mind, I don't believe anyone would notice." This takes us then to snapshot number 9, which is Mason rallies support for his objection to the federal Constitution. Mason led the opposition to the ratification of the new Constitution. Slide 14 is an excerpt from his objections to the Constitution, the famous first paragraph. I want to read that to you now. There is no declaration of rights, and the laws of the general government being paramount to the laws and constitutions of the several states, the declaration of rights in the separate states are no security. There is no declaration of any kind for preserving the liberty of the press or the trial by jury in civil causes, nor against the danger of standing armies in peacetime. Mason had his objections printed and sent copies all across the country, including his old acquaintances Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. As soon as Mason's first 6 words, "There is no Declaration of Rights," became the rallying cry for the anti-federalists who opposed the new Constitution, and even for Federalists who supported the new Constitution but wanted there to be a written Bill of Rights. The Federalists who opposed Mason knew that they had to respond to Mason's declarations. Hamilton called the demand for a Bill of Rights the snake that Mason had created, and he wrote Federalist number 84, trying to kill the snake. He argued in Federalist 84 that not only was a Bill of Rights unnecessary, it would actually be dangerous. But Mason's idea of a Bill of Rights was too tough for even the Federalist writers to kill. Slide 15 is a copy of Thomas Jefferson's letter to James Madison. Jefferson is still in Paris, and as soon as he got a copy of the new Constitution and he read Mason's objections to the Constitution, he wrote a letter to James Madison. He began the letter politely with a list of things that he liked, but then he quickly turned, and I want you to notice how much of this language comes directly from George Mason. I will now add what I do not like. First, the omission of a Bill of Rights providing clearly and without the aid of sophisms for freedom of religion, freedom of the press, protection against standing armies, restriction against monopolies, the eternal and unremitting force of the habeas corpus laws and trials by jury. Let me add that a Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth, general and particular. And a Bill of Rights is what no just government should refuse or rest on inference. Which brings us then to snapshot number 10. Mason led the opposition to ratification at the Virginia Ratifying Convention that took place in Richmond, Virginia in the summer of 1788. Slide 16 are the 2 Federalist leaders, George Washington and James Madison. The Federalists, led by these 2 men, wanted to ratify the Constitution. They wanted a strong central government, and they did not want a written Bill of Rights. The anti-Federalist leaders, however, George Mason and Patrick Henry, wanted less centralized power in the federal government. They wanted more powers reserved to the states, and most importantly, they wanted a written Bill of Rights. Now, George Washington, who was a truly great man, had long thought of the American nation as a single entity, rather than a collection of independent sovereign states. Some historians have made a very interesting observation regarding the leaders of the Federalists and the leaders of the Anti-Federalists. Madison and Washington, who led the Federalists at the Virginia Convention, were both men of wealth, and although both were married, none of them had any children. They were much more supportive of a strong central power, and they were much more willing to sacrifice Virginia's sovereignty to build a stronger national country. Mason and Henry, on the other hand, who were the leading anti-Federalists at the convention, although they were men of wealth, unlike Madison and Washington, they had very large families. With many sons to launch in life, Mason and Henry could not afford to cede away Virginia's state sovereignty, particularly with the issue of titles to land. The case that we study in Martin versus Hunter's lessee in constitutional law shows that Mason foresaw exactly what would happen. Consequently, Mason and Henry were much more tied to a local power and wanted a weaker central government. Washington and Madison had the luxury of thinking about posterity in general terms and thinking of everybody across the nation equally. Henry and Mason, however, didn't think about posterity in general terms. They saw the faces of posterity every night around their dinner table. Mason fought hard against ratification of the Virginia Ratifying Convention and gave 5 major points. The first, he warned against federal taxes. He said it was too dangerous to give the federal government the power of direct taxation, and argued early on, as we will see in later Supreme Court cases, that the power to tax is the power to destroy. Mason's words were then used in McCulloch versus Maryland later. Second, Mason warned against standing armies in peacetime. He pointed out historically that in every country in Europe which had allowed standing armies during peacetime, it had destroyed the liberties of the citizens of those countries. Third, he argued again that the executive branch was too strong. The lack of term limits, among other things, on the executive power would allow the president to take on the trappings of a king and establish a tyrannical power. The nation would eventually decide that Mason was right. The 22nd Amendment that was ratified in 1951 finally put term limits on the president. Fourth, Mason warned that the federal judiciary was too strong. He said that they would render the state courts impotent, which is what happened. He said that they would favor the federal Congress, which would extend the government power of the federal government and wipe out the states' meaningful powers to pass and execute their own laws. And he turned out to be right on that account as well. And then lastly, fifth and most importantly, he again complained that there was no Bill of Rights, no written Bill of Rights. Mason again lost the battle. The ratification took place, and Virginia ratified the new Constitution without a Bill of Rights. The vote was 89 to 79, and it was a very close vote. If only 5 votes had gone differently, Virginia would not have ratified the Constitution. And because of the leadership of Virginia in the country at that time, it's probable that other states may not have ratified the Constitution as well. Which takes us to snapshot number 11. Modern Americans view the Bill of Rights as the most important part of the Constitution. It is a great irony, as I believed before doing this project, that James Madison is the father of the Bill of Rights. I had always been taught that, but it's not true. Madison fought the Bill of Rights at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. Madison fought against the Bill of Rights in the Virginia ratifying Constitution in 1788. Well, what happened with James Madison that made him change his principles and finally support a Bill of Rights? Well, he wanted to be elected to Congress. And he was running in a district against James Monroe, who was an anti-federalist, and there were many anti-federalist voters. And Madison recognized correctly that he could not get elected if he did not promise to support a Bill of Rights. So, as one of Mason's biographers writes, the supposed father of the Bill of Rights had to be dragged kicking and screaming into finally supporting a Bill of Rights. I believe, on the other hand, that George Mason is the true father of the Bill of Rights, and I want to give you 6 reasons. The first reason is the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776, from which many of the rights come. The second reason that Mason is the true father is his work at the Constitutional Convention. He was the leading proponent of a Bill of Rights there. The third reason is Mason's objections to the Constitution of Government in 1787. It was his objections and their publication that alerted the country not only to the fact that there was not a Bill of Rights in the new Constitution, but that there should be one. The fourth reason that Mason's the true father of the Bill of Rights is his work at the Virginia Ratifying Convention. The fifth reason is that it was Mason who created popular support for a Bill of Rights. It was his publication and his argument in his objections that finally created a groundswell of popular support for a Bill of Rights. 5 states, including the important states of Virginia, Massachusetts, and New York, although they ratified the Constitution without a Bill of Rights, they also sent proposed amendments to Congress when they sent the ratification notice. Slide 19 are the amendments that Mason suggested at the Virginia Ratifying Convention. And you'll see here that this, in my view, makes him the true author of the Bill of Rights. You'll see that of the 29, we'll see later in the chart in the handout, of the 29 rights in the first 8 amendments, 24 of them come from these amendments that he suggested at the Virginia Convention. And this brings us then to snapshot number 12, which is Mason's death and legacy. This is George Mason's tomb. His tomb is on this side without very much inscription at all. The tomb on the side that has a brass plate is the tomb of his first wife, Anne. The Bill of Rights was ratified on December 15, 1791. That Bill of Rights is George Mason's true legacy both to us and to all the world. George Mason died less than a year later on October 7, 1792. The last visitor to call on Mason before he died was Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson spent 2 days with him, during which time Mason recounted everything that he could recall that happened at the Constitutional Convention. Jefferson knew that Mason was about to die, and Jefferson had not been able to attend the Constitutional Convention because he had been ambassador to France at that time. Slide 21 then is our Bill of Rights, our first 10 amendments. These rights are every bit as significant as the body of the Constitution itself. The First Amendment, of course, protects our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of association, and the right to petition the government. The Second Amendment preserves our right to bear arms. Our Third Amendment preserves our homes as our castles, making it prohibiting any government from quartering soldiers in peacetime in our homes without our consent. The Fourth through Eighth Amendments are extremely important because they limit the otherwise unbridled power of the judiciary in the federal Constitution. And lastly, the Ninth and Tenth Amendments at the end. The Ninth Amendment provides that the listing of rights in the Constitution is not exclusive, but very importantly, the listing of powers given to the federal government is. Because of the Tenth Amendment, if there is not an express grant of power to the government in the Constitution, it's reserved to the states and to the people respectively. The Bill of Rights is the ultimate protection for the rights of a vast diversity of human beings that have called themselves Americans now for 229 years. More than any other aspect of our founding, it's the Bill of Rights that makes us a united single people. So in conclusion, how should we evaluate the life and works of George Mason? In view of the impact of the Bill of Rights, I believe that although Mason was a flawed human being, like we all are, he has perhaps one of the most impactful lives in all of human history. I think that one way to measure his greatness is to compare him to other great men. As a lawgiver, like Moses, George Mason gave us a decalogue that will lead us to happiness and peace and prosperity as long as we will just follow its provisions. As a founder, like Brutus, he freed his people from a tyrannical king and established a model of government that became an example for all the world. As a patriot like Cincinnatus, he responded to his country's call during times of crisis, not once, but twice. And after the crisis was over and he had solved the problem, he rejected a grateful nation's offer of position and power so that he could simply return home to his farm and live as a private citizen. And lastly, as a sage like Lord Acton, George Mason recognized the corrupting influence of power. He recognized that power corrupts, that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and furthermore, that power corrupts governments as thoroughly as it can corrupt any individual. At the beginning of the talk, I told you that I wanted to try to share my opinions as to what it was about Mason that helped him achieve this great achievement. I think there are 3 things that he did that give examples to us that perhaps we can emulate in our own lives. The first is that he developed his intellect. The second is that he developed his character. And third, he matured spiritually. These last 2 things are things that our education system has now forgotten. How did he develop his intellect? Well, if you remember, he developed his mind through hard study in his uncle's library. He studied the great legal philosophers, he studied the great political philosophers, and he studied the great historians. As I say every day in every one of my classes, a page of history is worth a volume of logic and understanding the law. How did Mason develop his character? From an early stage in his life, Mason made the decision that he was willing to stand by the right, even to the sacrifice of life itself. And he learned at an early age that death was preferable to dishonor. Once his character was molded, it became easy for him to resist all the pressures that his friends and former supporters could place on him to do what they wanted to do and to do what he thought was right and refuse to sign the Constitution without a Bill of Rights. He paid a very high price in popularity and in friendships, including losing his most valued and treasured friendship, but he never wavered in his resolve. Lastly, how did Mason mature spiritually? Mason, like all of us, was a sinner, and like all of us, he was a fallen man. But although he was in the world, he always struggled to not be of the world. He avoided the boastful pride of life by turning down position in public office. He was careful to honor the two greatest commandments that we have. The first, to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, our soul, and our mind. And secondly, that we love our neighbors as ourselves. And I want to focus on that. It was from the command to love our neighbors that Mason developed his opposition to slavery, that he advocated the equality and independence of all men, and that he dedicated himself to protecting the rights and liberty of all of our citizens. Several times during my career as a lawyer, I had the sad task of being called to someone who was passing away. 3 times I was at the bedside of men who were dying without a will. They were desperate, they were frantic, and I did all I could to reassure them that their last interest would be followed. I learned from these experiences that men seldom tell you as much during their life, and they're seldom as truthful with you as they are approaching death. I'd like to read for you a very brief passage from George Mason's last will and testament, which are his last instructions to his sons. Quote, "I make these recommendations to my sons from my own experiences in life. You should always prefer the happiness and independence of a private life to the troubles and vexations of public affairs. If, however, you choose to engage in public affairs, then you must never let private interest or personal ambition or even the fear of death itself cause you to betray the liberty of your country or cause you to fail to pass it down to future generations." Rome's great republic lasted 482 years. That's how long it took the Romans to abandon their great republican constitution. Mason's lasting principles have shielded us from the lash of tyrants now for 229 years. Our founders gave us a constitution that established a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And George Mason gave us a Bill of Rights by which we can secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. As George Mason admonished his sons, it is we, the living, who must be careful never to betray the liberties of our country or fail to transmit those liberties to future generations. Thank you very much for your attention.